The photograph arrived at the Smoky Valley Memory Archive on an otherwise uneventful Wednesday morning, wrapped in the kind of brittle manila envelope that suggested decades of migration from drawer to drawer. Archivist Lucas Reynolds noticed the weight of it first, glass negative heavy, not a casual family print, and then the faint odor of camphor rising from the paper, the smell of a long-closed trunk. He carried the envelope to the isolation table near the back windows, where the museum's view opened onto the folds of rural Tennessee mountains. Morning fog still clung to the ridgeline as he slit open the envelope and slid out the contents. A single 1924 glass negative, 5x7 format, edges chipped but intact. A handwritten note accompanied it, found among mother's things. Children unknown. From Smoky Valley, perhaps kin. More. Lucas lowered the negative onto the illuminated plate. The image brightened from beneath, revealing 3 children standing in a small yard patched with summer grass. Ethan, 14, tall, awkward shoulders, hand half-raised as if the photographer had called to him. Mabel, 11, straight-backed, hair pinned severely, watching something just outside the frame. Oliver, 7, barefoot, chin tucked, one suspender half broken. At first glance, the photograph seemed unremarkable, a family posed quickly before chores, their clothing threadbare but tidy. Ordinary rural childhood. Yet Lucas felt the familiar prickle across the back of his neck, the instinct that had guided his entire career. Something in the composition was wrong. Not an accident, not time's natural decay, but an intentional violence. He adjusted the backlighting. There, to the far right of the frame, stretched a blank void, not the soft blur of motion nor the whitening caused by sun exposure, but a deliberate smear, an area where emulsion had been physically scraped away. Sharp crescent-shaped abrasions radiated from a single missing form. Someone had worked carefully, repeatedly, with a tool that cut through gelatin and silver halide alike. In the luminous center of those scratch marks, a faint outline emerged only when Lucas increased magnification, the curve of a child's sleeve, a sliver of shoe, the barely perceptible blur of a face turned toward the camera. A fourth presence. A child erased with determination. This wasn't damage, Lucas murmured. Someone removed him. He switched to high-resolution digital capture. As the scanner's sensors swept across the glass, a deeper detail surfaced, tiny directional striations consistent with manual scraping, the type performed by someone untrained, perhaps using a sewing needle or penknife. Not vandalism. Erasure. Lucas stepped back from the table, steadying himself. The Smoky Valley Archive was accustomed to receiving fading memories, letters from men who'd gone to war, quilts passed through generations, schoolhouse portraits stiff with dust. But this was different. This was evidence. And he knew, even before naming it aloud, what the photograph implied. In the southern Appalachian logging economies of the 1920s, families in deep debt were pressured, sometimes coerced, into surrendering their youngest children to company camps, to cook, to haul water, to carry lumber scraps, to work until small bodies broke under labor never meant for them. These dead children, uncounted in official ledgers, often vanished entirely, into forests, mills, and early graves. If someone erased a child from a photograph, it was not to forget him. It was to hide him from those who might seize him. Lucas exhaled slowly. The erased figure was not a stranger. He fit the birth order precisely, the smallest shape where a youngest sibling would stand. This image was not an accident of history. It was a signal. He turned back to the glowing negative, the ghost of the missing child flickering beneath layers of damage. "Who were you?" he whispered. "And who wanted you gone?" Lucas retrieved the museum's condition log and began documenting the negative with the practiced precision of someone who understood the stakes of every small detail. His pencil moved steadily, asterisk manual abrasion on right margin, directional scraping toward center, residual emulsion particulate, asterisk, but his thoughts drifted beyond procedure. How many hands had touched this object before it reached him? Who had held the decision to erase a child, and who had lived with the silence that followed? He switched off the backlight and allowed the room's dimness to settle again. Outside, the Smoky Valley morning had brightened into a harsh, colorless glare that pressed against the windows. From this vantage, the museum looked out over an expanse of steep hollows and narrow farms, fields that had once fed entire families, then fed the companies that arrived promising wages they never fully paid. It was in those years, Lucas knew, that the mills learned to take what debtors could not afford to lose. He returned to the photograph. At higher contrast, the children's postures revealed tension he had missed earlier. Ethan's half-raised hand was not greeting the camera, it was reaching behind Mabel, toward the void where the erased sibling should have stood. Mabel herself remained rigid, chin elevated, as though holding the pose long after the others had shifted. Only Oliver seemed unaware of the camera's strict choreography, his bare toes curled inward, as if bracing for ground colder than expected. Lucas studied the scraped region again. Whoever attempted the removal had worked slowly. The scratches overlapped in arcs, not hurried gouges. The act had been meticulous, almost protective. Someone had tried to keep the missing child from being counted, from being visible to any official who might later demand an accounting of how many young bodies lived under one roof. A knot tightened in Lucas's chest. He had handled forgotten tragedies before, but this was different. This felt like the beginning of a record that was never allowed to exist. And somewhere in the hollowed space of the photograph, the truth waited. Lucas opened the digital scan on the archival monitor, enlarging the erased section until individual grains of silver halide stood out like scattered frost. Even through distortion, faint geometry persisted, a child's sleeve seam, a contour too deliberate to be random noise. He traced the outline with his stylus, marking each surviving fragment in translucent red. The more he mapped, the clearer the missing figure became, as if the negative resisted its own mutilation. He leaned back, inhaling the cold scent of the climate-controlled room. The Smoky Valley Archive occupied a former schoolhouse, its white plank floors creaking faintly with each shift of weight. Lucas had grown accustomed to those sounds, yet today they seemed sharper, echoing with a presence he could not name. Some objects did that, bent the air around them. This negative carried the heaviness of withheld testimony. He opened the accession drawer and lifted a thin folder of regional mill records he had been cataloging the previous week. Inside, several ledger fragments from 1923 to 1929 listed children by first name only, recorded as meal carriers, washers, or simply helpers. Most were under 10. None bore surnames. Lucas reread the columns, imagining small hands submerged in cold creek water, bodies rising before dawn, and parents who had learned to fear the arrival of the company clerk more than the winter itself. He glanced again at the photograph. Ethan's tense posture, Mabel's vigilant stillness, Oliver's fragile uncertainty, each expression seemed to orbit the missing shape beside them. This was not a family merely posing, it was a family negotiating danger. The erasure, Lucas realized, was not intended to disguise negligence but to shield. Someone had risked damaging the only surviving image in order to keep one child uncounted. He saved the annotated scan and whispered into the quiet room, "You didn't disappear on your own." The scratched void felt suddenly alive, like a doorway ajar. He dimmed the monitor and reached for the envelope again, checking for any overlooked material, a receipt, a penciled surname, even the faintest imprint of a return address. Nothing. Only dust along the flap's inner crease, the kind that collected in attic boxes pushed behind steamer trunks. Whoever mailed this had chosen anonymity with care. Lucas carried the negative to the viewing wall, where a soft floodlight projected the enlarged scan nearly life-size. The children's faces sharpened into the clarity of presence, Ethan's guarded watchfulness, Mabel's compressed composure, Oliver's hesitant stance. The scraped region expanded beside them, a pale storm of abrasion. At this scale, the damage appeared almost violent, yet the pattern remained too controlled for rage. It was work done by someone who understood that removing a face was sometimes the last defense a parent had. He stepped closer, studying the empty space as if proximity might coax a memory from it. In the rural South of the 1920s, erasure was not always destruction, it could be strategy. Families sometimes burned birth papers, hid children in barns during census visits, or taught them to answer to borrowed names to mislead mill recruiters. Lucas had read accounts of mothers pressing soot across their children's cheeks to make them appear sickly when company men rode through on horses. Some protection required invisibility. The thought tugged at him. If the missing figure had been the youngest sibling, the one most vulnerable to seizure, the erasure might have been a desperate measure, carving him out of the record to keep him from being tallied as laborable. Lucas touched the edge of the projected void, though the air only shimmered faintly beneath his hand. "You belonged here," he said quietly, a statement more to steady himself than to claim authority. Something about the composition suggested a story half buried, an ordinary yard, ordinary clothes, but tension strung tight as wire. A family preparing for something approaching. He knew he couldn't continue alone. The next step required another eye. Lucas powered down the projector and stood in the dim light, listening to the quiet hum of the HVAC system threading through the rafters. The temperature never wavered in the archive, yet he felt a faint chill as he slid the negative back into its temporary housing. Objects with troubled histories sometimes generated their own atmosphere. Archivists felt it in their bones before they acknowledged it in words. He crossed to his desk and opened the correspondence drawer. A stack of business cards rested inside, each representing specialists he had consulted over the years: conservators, historians, chemists. His fingers moved past them until he reached a narrow white card printed in dark blue ink: Dr. Hank Warren, Photographic Forensics, Appalachian Photographic Institute. Lucas hesitated only a moment before dialing the number. As the line rang, he stared at the enigmatic photograph again, its muted shadows forming a tight geometry of silence. He imagined the family the day the camera arrived: children rearranged by height, mother smoothing collars, father trying to settle restless hands. Yet the tension in their expressions suggested something else: awareness. As though they already understood the dangers that hovered around them, waiting for the smallest misstep. Dr. Warren answered on the fourth ring. Lucas summarized the situation carefully, omitting the more speculative conclusions. Warren listened without interruption, then said, "Bring it. Today if you can." Deliberate erasure of a child figure in a rural negative from that decade. That's never innocent. The certainty in his voice struck Lucas with both relief and unease. He wrapped the negative in acid-free paper, placed it inside a reinforced case, and signed the removal log. As he locked the archive door behind him, the mountains beyond the parking lot seemed sharper than usual, their ridgelines carved against the pale sky. Morning had slipped into the severe clarity of noon, and the sunlight felt too direct, as though it sought to expose whatever the photograph had tried to conceal. Lucas placed the case in the passenger seat, started the engine, and whispered to the empty car, "We're going to find you." The drive from Smoky Valley to the Appalachian Photographic Institute wound through narrow two-lane roads flanked by kudzu-thick embankments and dilapidated barns collapsing under their own histories. Lucas kept one hand steady on the wheel while the other hovered protectively near the reinforced case beside him, as though the photograph might sense turbulence. He drove slowly, mindful of every curve. Some objects deserved a procession. As he ascended a ridge, the air thinned and cooled. Sunlight flickered between the trees in long vertical bands, and for several minutes the road felt suspended between shadow and glare. Lucas's mind returned to the partially erased child. The fragmentary outline he had reconstructed had been slight, no more than 5 or 6 years old. A vulnerable age, old enough to work in the peripheries of a logging camp, young enough to be used without pay or paperwork. Too often, the youngest disappeared without a trace, absorbed into the machinery of debt. He wondered who had wielded the scraping tool. A mother? An older sibling? Someone trembling as they pressed metal against glass, knowing each stroke risked destroying the only visual memory they possessed. The thought tightened his throat. Erasure required unbearable courage. A sudden bend opened into a clearing, revealing the institute perched on a knoll of exposed limestone. The building's tall windows flashed in the afternoon light like watchful eyes. Lucas pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching loudly in the otherwise still air. He lifted the case gently, feeling the cool metal against his palms, and stepped out. Dr. Warren waited in the entryway, arms crossed, expression grave. He was a broad-shouldered man with a scholar's careful demeanor, someone who measured every movement for precision. When Lucas approached, Warren nodded toward the case. "That the one?" "Yes." Let's see what's been hidden, Warren murmured, holding the door open. Inside, the institute smelled of dustless air and muted chemicals. As Lucas followed Warren down the corridor, he sensed the weight of what he carried grow heavier, less an object now than a testimony reaching for light. Warren guided Lucas into the institute's forensic imaging lab, a long, windowless room lit only by controlled overhead strips that left no shadows for errors to hide. Metal cabinets lined the walls, each labeled with dates, emulsions, and defunct manufacturers. In the center stood a heavy table with a mounted copy stand and a bank of spectral lights ready for activation. "Set the case here," Warren said, clearing a space with practiced efficiency. Lucas opened the latches slowly, revealing the negative cushioned in its acid-free sleeves. Warren's posture shifted. He leaned forward with the reverence of someone encountering not a fragile object but a survivor. He lifted the glass by its edges and held it up to the neutral light. The scraped region glimmered unevenly. Warren frowned. "Intentional," he murmured. "Not vandalism." Someone knew exactly where the body fell on the emulsion. He placed the negative on the copy stand and activated the ultraviolet array. The room dimmed to violet dusk as the scratches lit up like frost patterns on metal. Lucas watched him lean closer. "See that?" Warren pointed to a faint curvature in the illuminated void. "That's the remnant of a shoulder line. Whoever erased this started at the face and worked outward. That's typical when the goal is identity removal, not sabotage." Lucas felt the statement settle heavily. So the missing child was known. Recognizable. And dangerous to be recognized, Warren added. He adjusted the light spectrum to infrared, revealing deeper scars beneath the surface. The erased figure's outline appeared ghost-like, an impression left by pressure rather than surviving emulsion. Warren scanned the negative with a calibrated camera, each pass humming softly. "We'll build a reconstruction, but the context matters more." Erasures like this occurred in mountain communities dealing with labor collectors. Families sometimes mutilated negatives before the company men came through, assuming photographs could be used as informal census tools. Lucas nodded slowly. "A way to stay uncounted."